The wealthiest people you admire are in debt, not by accident, not by misfortune, but by design. And if that statement makes you uncomfortable, that's exactly where we need to begin. Because somewhere along the way, you were taught a rule that feels almost sacred. Avoid debt at all costs. Stay clean, stay safe, stay free. And yet, the very people who seem the most financially free are the ones carrying the largest liabilities on paper. That contradiction is not a coincidence. It is the illusion. You were raised to believe that owing money is a sign of weakness, that it represents a lack of control, a failure to manage what you already have. And for most people, that belief becomes a guiding principle. They work, they earn, they pay off what they owe, and they repeat the cycle with quiet discipline. It feels responsible, it feels mature, it feels right. But what if that entire framework is incomplete? What if the rule you've been following was never designed to help you build wealth, only to keep you stable enough to survive within the system? Because the truth is far less comforting than the advice you've been given. Debt, in itself, is not the enemy. It is a tool. And like any tool, it depends entirely on the hands that use it. In the hands of the uninformed, it destroys. In the hands of the strategic, it multiplies. The same mechanism that traps one person can accelerate another. The same bank that burdens you can empower someone else. The difference is not access, it is understanding. Think about how most people interact with money. They trade time for income, they save what they can, and when they take on debt, it is usually tied to consumption, a car that depreciates, a lifestyle upgrade, a moment of relief or status. And then comes the obligation, the monthly payments, the interest, the quiet pressure that never fully disappears. Over time, that kind of debt becomes a weight, not because debt is inherently heavy, but because it was never designed to carry you forward. It was designed to be carried. Now, contrast that with the behavior of someone who understands the system differently. They don't avoid debt, they engineer it. They don't see borrowing as a burden, they see it as leverage. And that word leverage is where the illusion begins to break. Leverage is the ability to use something you have to gain access to something greater. It is not about having more money. It is about making your existing position work harder than you ever could alone. The wealthy understand this at a level most people never question. They understand that money, when left idle, does nothing. But when strategically deployed, even if borrowed, it can begin to expand. So instead of asking, how do I eliminate my debt? They ask a different question entirely. How do I use debt to acquire something that grows? That shift may sound subtle, but it changes everything. Because once you begin to see debt not as a liability, but as a bridge between where you are and what you can control, your entire relationship with money starts to evolve. You stop reacting, you start positioning, you stop fearing the system, you start studying it. And this is where most people fall behind, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never encouraged to look deeper. They were taught rules, not frameworks, instructions, not strategies, and those rules were designed to keep them out of trouble, not to move them ahead. Pay off your debts as quickly as possible. Don't borrow more than you need. Live within your means. On the surface, these are not bad ideas. In fact, for someone without a plan, they are necessary, but they are not sufficient for building wealth. They are guidelines for stability, not for expansion. And if you follow them blindly, you may find yourself doing everything right and still going nowhere. Because the system you are operating within does not reward caution alone. It rewards control. It rewards those who understand how to move capital, not just preserve it. It rewards those who know when to hold and when to leverage. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed. The problem is that most people are playing by rules that were never meant to win the game, only to stay in it. The wealthy are not exempt from the system. They simply interact with it differently. They don't see a bank as a place to store money. They see it as a partner, a tool, a mechanism that allows them to access liquidity without sacrificing ownership. And that last part is critical: ownership. Because when most people need cash, they sell something, they liquidate, they give up a portion of what they own in exchange for immediate relief. And while that may solve the short-term problem, it often creates a long-term cost. The asset they sold could have grown. It could have compounded. It could have continued working quietly in the background. The wealthy avoid this whenever possible, not because they are afraid to sell, but because they understand the hidden cost of doing so. Instead of selling, they borrow against what they already own. They maintain control of the asset while unlocking the value within it. To someone on the outside, this looks like debt, but in reality, it is access. Access to capital, access to opportunity, access to time. And time, more than anything, is what allows wealth to compound. So when you hear that the wealthy are deeply in debt, what you are really hearing is that they are deeply positioned. Their debt is not tied to consumption. It is tied to assets. It is structured. It is intentional. And most importantly, it is serving a purpose. This is the distinction most people never fully grasp. Not all debt is created equal. There is debt that consumes you, and there is debt that constructs something beyond you. One traps, the other builds. One demands constant attention, the other works quietly in the background. And if you cannot tell the difference, you will treat them the same. You will fear them equally, and in doing so, you will avoid the very mechanism that could have changed your trajectory. But this is not just a financial misunderstanding, it is a psychological one. Because at its core, your relationship with debt is not about numbers, it is about identity. If you see yourself as someone who owes, debt will always feel like a burden, something to escape, something to eliminate as quickly as possible. But if you begin to see yourself as someone who controls assets, debt becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tool you can direct, a resource you can shape, a lever you can pull when the conditions are right. And that shift from owing to controlling is not taught in most environments. It is discovered, often slowly, often painfully, and usually only after someone realizes that the path they were following leads to stability. But not freedom, because freedom is not just the absence of obligation, it is the presence of options. And options require capital, not just the capital you have, but the capital you can access. That is the game. Not how much you earn, not how little you owe, but how effectively you can position what you already have. And once you begin to see that, the illusion starts to fade. You start to question why some people seem to accelerate while others remain stuck. Even when they are working just as hard, you start to notice patterns subtle at first, then undeniable. The same tools producing wildly different outcomes. The same system rewarding one group while quietly constraining another. And eventually, a realization begins to take shape. Maybe the difference was never effort. Maybe it was never discipline. Maybe it was perspective. Because the moment you understand that debt is not inherently good or bad, but simply directional, you begin to ask better questions. Not, should I avoid debt? But what is this debt connected to? Not how fast can I pay this off? But what is this helping me build? And those questions lead you somewhere most people never go. They lead you. Banks don't hate debt, they hate uncertainty. And once you understand that, something subtle begins to shift in the way you see the entire financial system. Because what most people interpret as rejection, restriction, or unfairness is often just a response to risk. Not your risk as a person, but the risk embedded in your position. The average borrower walks into a bank carrying one thing: income, a job, a promise of future earnings. And while that may seem like a stable foundation, from the bank's perspective, it is fragile. Income can disappear, jobs can end, circumstances can change. So the bank protects itself. It adds layers of scrutiny, interest, intentional sows. It limits exposure. It controls the terms. But the wealthy walk in with something entirely different. They walk in with assets, not just income, but ownership. Not just a paycheck, but positions that exist independently of their time. And that distinction changes everything, because when a bank sees assets, real estate, equity, business ownership, it no longer sees uncertainty. It sees collateral. It sees protection. It sees a scenario where, even if something goes wrong, the system still holds. And when risk decreases, everything else begins to open. Interest rates drop. Approval becomes easier. Terms become flexible. In some cases, the bank begins to compete not to protect itself from you, but to work with you. And to someone who has only experienced the system from the outside, this feels like a completely different world. But it isn't a different world. It's the same system, responding differently to different inputs. This is the mechanism behind what appears to be an illusion. Because when people hear that the wealthy borrow money easily, they assume it's because of status, or connections, or privilege. And while those factors can play a role, they are not the foundation. The foundation is structure. The wealthy don't ask for money. They position themselves so that money becomes available. And that positioning begins with a simple but powerful distinction, one that most people never consciously make. There is a difference between borrowing to consume and borrowing to acquire. Consumption debt is tied to things that lose value or fail to produce anything beyond temporary satisfaction. A car that depreciates the moment it leaves the lot. A purchase that brings comfort today but adds pressure tomorrow. This type of debt is common. It is normalized. It is often even encouraged. But from a structural standpoint, it creates a problem because it does not generate the means to sustain itself. It relies entirely on external input: your time, your energy, your income to be maintained. And over time, that creates a loop. You work to pay for something that does not work for you. You trade effort for maintenance. And slowly, without realizing it, your capacity becomes tied to your obligations. This is the kind of debt that feels heavy, not because of the numbers, but because of the direction. Now, contrast that with acquisition debt. This is debt used to obtain something that has the potential to grow, produce income, or increase in value over time. It is not tied to consumption. It is tied to expansion. A piece of real estate that generates rental income, an investment in a business that produces cash flow, a position in a market that appreciates over time. In these scenarios, the debt is not the end point. It is the entry point, and that changes the equation entirely, because now, instead of relying solely on your own effort to repay what you owe, you have introduced a second force into the system, something that can begin to offset and eventually exceed the cost of the debt itself. This is where leverage becomes real, not as a concept, but as a mechanism. You are no longer just managing money, you are directing it, and the bank, in this scenario, is not your adversary, it is your partner. Not because it wants to help you, but because the structure makes sense. The risk is contained, the collateral is clear, the system functions. But there is another layer to this one that most people never fully explore. The wealthy don't just use debt to acquire assets, they use it to avoid selling them. And this is where the illusion becomes even more powerful. Because selling an asset, while straightforward, comes with consequences. It triggers a taxable event. It reduces your ownership. It interrupts the compounding process. It solves an immediate need, but often at the cost of future growth. Borrowing, on the other hand, does something entirely different. It allows you to access liquidity cash without triggering a sale. You maintain ownership. The asset continues to grow, and the loan, structured properly, becomes a temporary layer rather than a permanent loss. To someone unfamiliar with this structure, it looks like unnecessary debt. Why borrow when you could simply sell? Why carry an obligation when you have the means to eliminate it? But to someone who understands the system, the answer is clear. Because selling breaks the engine, borrowing fuels it. Imagine holding an asset that has grown significantly over time. Selling it would provide immediate capital, but it would also lock in taxes and remove your position from future growth. Borrowing against it However, allows you to extract value while keeping the engine running. The asset remains, the growth continues, the system compounds, and the cost of the loan, when compared to the potential return of the asset, becomes a calculated trade-off rather than a burden. This is not reckless, it is strategic, but it requires something most people are never taught: to develop comfort with complexity. Because this system is not simple, it is layered. It involves understanding interest rates, risk management, timing, and structure. It requires patience, it requires discipline, and perhaps most importantly, it requires a shift in perspective. You have to stop seeing debt as a single category. You have to start seeing it as a spectrum. On one end, there is debt that drains you: consumption, impulse, obligation without return. On the other, there is debt that supports you: structured, intentional, connected to assets that move independently of your effort. And everything in between depends on how it is used. The problem is that most people are only exposed to one side of that spectrum. They experience the draining side, the heavy side, the side that demands constant attention and offers little in return. And from that experience, they form a belief: debt is dangerous. But what they are really experiencing is not debt itself, it is misuse. And once that belief is formed, it becomes self-reinforcing. They avoid borrowing, they avoid risk, they avoid the very mechanisms that could allow them to move beyond their current position. And in doing so, they remain safe, but static. Meanwhile, those who understand the other side of the spectrum begin to operate differently. They study the structure, they build positions, they acquire assets not just for ownership, but for optionality. They create a foundation that allows them to access capital without sacrificing control. And over time, that difference compounds, not just financially, but psychologically, because when you know that you can access capital without losing what you've built, your decisions change. You think longer term, you act with more intention. You are not forced into reactive choices because of immediate pressure. You have room, and room creates clarity. Clarity creates strategy, and strategy, over time, creates outcomes that look almost invisible from the outside. This is why the system appears unequal, because the visible actions, borrowing, holding debt, leveraging assets, look similar, but the underlying structure is completely different. One is reactive, the other is intentional. One is driven by need, the other by design. And until you understand that difference, you will continue to interpret the same behavior in the same way through the lens of your own experience. But once you begin to see the mechanism clearly, something shifts. You stop asking, why do they take off? There is a strategy so simple in structure that most people overlook it, not because it is hidden, but because it doesn't align with what they've been taught to believe. It doesn't feel intuitive, it doesn't feel safe, and yet, it quietly sits at the center of how immense wealth is built, preserved, and transferred across generations. 3 words: borrow. At first glance, it sounds almost too blunt, too mechanical, but behind those 3 words is a system that reshapes everything you thought you understood about money, ownership, and time, because while most people spend their lives trying to earn more, save more, and reduce what they owe, the wealthy operate on an entirely different sequence. They don't begin with income, they begin with acquisition. Not just anything, not consumption, not fleeting value. They focus on assets, things that have the potential to grow, to produce, to exist independently of their effort. Real estate that appreciates and generates income. Businesses that expand and scale. Equity in systems that compound over time. This first step is critical, because without an asset, the rest of the strategy does not exist. There is nothing to leverage, nothing to build upon, nothing to anchor the system. But once the asset is in place, something begins to happen. Time starts to work. The asset grows, it produces, it compounds quietly, often invisibly. while the outside world continues to measure progress in hours worked and income earned. And as that asset increases in value, it creates something more important than wealth itself. It creates options. And that is where the second step begins: borrow. This is where the illusion becomes difficult for most people to accept, because everything they've been taught tells them that borrowing is a sign of need, a response to lack, a temporary solution to a problem. But in this system, borrowing is not reactive, it is strategic. Instead of selling the asset to access its value, the wealthy borrow against it. They use the asset as collateral to unlock liquidity cash without giving up ownership. The asset remains in place. It continues to grow. It continues to produce, and yet, it also becomes a source of capital. To the outside observer, this looks like debt, but structurally, it is something else entirely. It is controlled access. Access to capital without interruption, without taxation from a sale, without breaking the compounding process that the asset is undergoing. It is the ability to extract value without dismantling the machine that creates it. And this is where the system reveals one of its most powerful advantages. Because when you sell an asset, you trigger a taxable event. A portion of what you've gained is immediately reduced. You convert growth into a fixed outcome. You step out of the compounding process. But when you borrow, you do not sell. You do not realize gains. You do not interrupt growth. You do not reduce your position. You simply layer a new structure on top of what already exists. And that structure, when managed correctly, becomes a bridge, allowing you to move capital through your life without dismantling the foundation beneath it. This is why the wealthy can appear to live on borrowed money, because, in many cases, they do, but not in the way most people imagine. They are not borrowing to survive. They are borrowing to preserve ownership, to preserve growth, to preserve the system they have built. And as long as the asset continues to perform, continues to appreciate, continues to produce, the cost of borrowing becomes just another variable in a much larger equation. An equation that most people never see because they are focused on the surface, on the idea that debt equals obligation, that owing money equals weakness, that the presence of a loan is inherently negative. But in this system, the loan is not the problem, it is the tool. And like any tool, its value depends entirely on what it is connected to. Now, if the strategy ended here, buy and borrow, it would already be powerful. But there is a third step, one that is rarely discussed openly, yet is fundamental to the entire structure. Not in a dramatic sense, not as an endpoint to be feared, but as a transfer point within the system, because when assets are passed on to the next generation, something remarkable happens. In many systems, the value of those assets is reset. The gains that accumulated over time are no longer treated the same way they would be if the original owner had sold them. The tax implications shift, the structure resets, and the wealth, built over decades, moves forward without being fully eroded by the mechanisms that would have applied during the original owner's lifetime. And the debt? It is often resolved within that same system, paid off, restructured, or absorbed in a way that does not dismantle the asset itself. The result is something that, from the outside, appears almost impossible. Wealth that grows, is accessed, and is transferred with minimal friction, not because the system is broken, but because it is functioning exactly as designed. And this is the part that challenges people the most, because it forces a confrontation with a deeper truth. You were never just taught to avoid debt. You were taught to operate in a way that would never lead you here, to focus on income instead of ownership, to prioritize elimination instead of expansion, to seek security instead of structure. And in doing so, you were given a path that is stable, but limited. A path that keeps you moving, but not necessarily advancing, while elsewhere, quietly, another path exists, one that is built on different assumptions. That assets matter more than income. That control matters more than simplicity. That time, when paired with the right structure, becomes the most powerful force of all. This is why the strategy feels uncomfortable, because it requires you to rethink not just what you do with money, but how you see it entirely. Money is no longer something you simply earn and spend. It becomes something you position, something you direct, something you allow to move through systems that amplify its effect over time. And debt, within that context, is no longer something to eliminate as quickly as possible. It becomes something to understand, to shape, to use with precision, because when connected to the right asset, under the right conditions, at the right time, it does something most people never experience. It accelerates, not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately, and that acceleration, compounded over years, creates outcomes that appear disproportionate to the effort involved. But the effort was never the point. The structure was. And once you begin to see that, the illusion begins to collapse completely. You realize that the wealthy are not taking on debt because they have to. They are doing it because it allows them to keep what they have while accessing what they need. They are not trapped by their obligations. They are supported by their structure. And that is a fundamentally different position, one that cannot be reached through caution alone, one that requires understanding, and perhaps most importantly, one that requires a shift in identity. Because at some point, this stops being about strategy. It becomes about who you believe you are allowed to become within the system. This was never just about debt. It was never just about banks, or assets, or strategies whispered in rooms most people never enter. Because even now, after understanding the structure, after seeing how the system actually works, there is still a gap. And that gap is not financial, it is personal. Because knowing something and becoming the kind of person who can use it are two entirely different things. And that is where most people stop. They understand the concept, they see the logic, they even feel the shift beginning to happen. But when it comes time to act, when it comes time to step into a different way of operating, they hesitate. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they are still holding on to an identity that was built around a different set of rules, an identity that says, I don't want to owe anyone, I don't want to take risks, I don't want to lose what I have. And on the surface, those beliefs sound responsible, they sound careful, they sound like the kind of thinking that protects you, but protection and progress are not the same thing. And if your entire approach to money is built on avoiding loss, you will rarely position yourself for growth, because growth requires movement, and movement requires exposure, not reckless exposure, not blind risk, but a willingness to engage with uncertainty in a way that most people avoid. This is the identity shift, the point where you stop asking, how do I stay safe? And start asking, how do I position myself to expand? Because the wealthy are not fearless, they are structured, they don't ignore risk, they define it, they contain it, they work within it. And that is a completely different mindset. When you begin to see debt not as something that controls you, but as something that can be directed, your relationship with money changes. You stop reacting emotionally to numbers on a statement. You start analyzing what those numbers represent. Is this debt connected to something that grows? Is it producing? Is it compounding? Is it moving me forward or holding me in place? These are the questions that separate movement from stagnation. And once you begin asking them consistently, your decisions start to shift. You no longer chase upgrades that feel good in the moment, but create pressure over time. You begin to delay consumption in favor of positioning. You start to see opportunities where you once saw obstacles, not because the opportunities were hidden, but because your perspective was, but this is not about becoming aggressive. It is about becoming intentional. Because one of the greatest misconceptions about leverage is that it requires bold, high-risk moves, that it demands large capital, complex strategies, or access to elite networks. In reality, it begins much smaller. It begins with awareness, understanding the difference between what takes from you and what builds for you. A small asset that produces even a modest return is fundamentally different from a liability that requires constant input. And once you experience that difference, even at a small scale, it begins to reshape how you think. Because, for the first time, something is working without your direct effort. And that changes your expectations. It introduces a new possibility, that your time is not the only source of value, that your income does not have to be tied exclusively to your presence, that there are structures, systems that can begin to operate in parallel with your life. And once that idea takes hold, it becomes difficult to ignore, because now every decision carries a different weight. You begin to evaluate not just the immediate outcome, but the long-term direction. Is this moving me closer to ownership or further into obligation? Is this expanding my options or narrowing them? And over time, those small decisions compound. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, quietly, in the same way the system itself operates. And this is where discipline becomes essential. Not the discipline of restriction, not the kind that forces you to say no to everything, but the discipline of alignment, making choices that reflect where you are trying to go, not just where you are. Because without that alignment, knowledge remains theoretical. You can understand the system completely and still remain outside of it. You can see the path and never take the first step. And that is the quiet reality for many people. They learn, they observe, they even agree, but they do not act. Because action requires a shift that goes beyond information. It requires a willingness to become someone different. Someone who is comfortable holding assets instead of chasing income. Someone who is patient enough to let systems develop instead of forcing immediate results. Someone who can tolerate the discomfort of not knowing exactly how things will unfold, while still moving forward with intention. This is not easy, and it is not meant to be, because if it were, the outcomes would not be what they are. The system does not reward everyone equally, not because it is unfair, but because it responds to how it is used, and most people never take the time to learn how to use it. They remain focused on the surface, on earning more, spending less, avoiding mistakes, and, while those behaviors are not wrong, they are incomplete. They keep you stable, but they do not necessarily move you forward. Forward requires something else. It requires structure, a deliberate approach to how you build, how you borrow, how you position what you have so that it begins to work beyond your direct involvement. And that process takes time. There are no shortcuts, no sudden transformations, only gradual shifts in perspective, in behavior, in identity, until one day you look at your financial life and it no longer feels reactive. It feels designed, not perfect, not without risk, but intentional. And that intention creates a sense of control that most people never experience. Because control is not about eliminating uncertainty, it is about understanding it, working within it, using it when the conditions are right, and stepping back when they are not. This is what separates those who are constantly responding to their circumstances from those who begin to shape them. And that separation, over time, becomes visible. Not immediately, not in obvious ways, but in patterns, in trajectories, in outcomes that seem subtle at first, and then undeniable. And when you reach that point, something else becomes clear. The bank was never your enemy. It was never designed to hold you back. It simply responds to what you bring into the system. Your structure, your positioning, your understanding. If you enter with uncertainty, it protects itself. If you enter with clarity, it begins to open. And that is not a judgment. It is a mechanism, one that has always been there, one that will continue to function the same way, regardless of who chooses to understand it. So the question is no longer whether the system is fair. The question is whether you are willing to see it clearly, to move beyond the assumptions that have shaped your decisions, to challenge the beliefs that have kept you operating within a limited range. Because once you do, there is no going back. You begin to notice things you never saw before, patterns that were invisible, opportunities that once felt out of reach, and gradually, almost quietly, Your relationship with money changes, not because you suddenly have more of it, but because you are no longer interacting with it the same way. You are no longer just earning. You are positioning. You are no longer just paying. You are directing. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, is what begins to separate stability from freedom. Because stability keeps you where you are. Freedom allows you to move, to choose, to build something that extends beyond your immediate effort. And that is the real outcome of understanding this system. Not just more money, but more